Hello and welcome to Avatar Harbour for December. It is the end of 2023 and I have done 24 of these videos. How amazing and incredible and absolutely horrifying. This has been so interesting because finally at the finish up this year, I finished up my 12 categories, most of which I'm pretty tired of, but let's talk about the last set of 7 books for the year. Oh, I'm this way. Okay, there we go. So, why is this so difficult? That's 7 very colourful spines, and let's get right into that. Book number 1, this is The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. She is a Chilean author, and this is her first novel. It's really, really fascinating, although I will be honest, it's been a while since I've read this, so I may get some of the details wrong. But this is very tightly integrated with Chilean history. In fact, Allende is related to one of the, I think, presidents of Chile during a period of political turbulence. There were really... How can I say this without missing words? There was a coup, there was a political coup, and it was a very turbulent and violent time in Chile, and that is interwoven with a very personal narrative in The House of the Spirits. Now, some of this you can argue is autobiographical. I don't know the author that well, so I don't really want to go out of my way to make that interpretation. I just want to talk about, overall, I think that in terms of a magical realist novel from Latin America, this one, to me, was really easy to follow and really affecting. So it reminded me a lot of 100 Years of Solitude, and not just because of the language and the geographical elements, but also just this book is inspired by it, and the structure of it being a multi-generational saga with a lot of surreal or fantastical events happening to what is otherwise very human relationships. It felt quite familiar, and in a sense I almost wanted to have read this before I read 100 Years of Solitude, because this is much more accessible. The characters, to me, feel much more realistically emotional, whereas of 100 Years of Solitude, I said of that book, it's about towns and societies and ideas more so than it is about people. This book is about people, and I find people much easier to connect to. We have characters that are very easy to relate to, they go through so much, and they feel like reasonable exaggerations of normal human beings. So although the things that happen to them or the ways that they react to certain situations are exaggerated to the point of fantasy, they feel like emotions that are familiar to things that I personally have gone through or I've seen other people go through. Things that are just universal, things like familial issues, questions of social class and romance, and all of that is really deftly woven with these more political and historical elements of this novel that really do feel like an individual author trying to grapple with the idea of how do you write fiction? How do you write stories about normal human beings entangled with the kinds of political questions that were happening in Chile at the time? And so I thought this was really successful. I enjoyed so much of it. It is still hard to follow at times because it is a generational epic and because the characters have a bit of an unusual family tree, if I want to just say it lightly. It doesn't have that family tree that 100 Years of Solitude had, so I wasn't able to consult it as I read. But it wasn't that hard to follow. It wasn't something that I had to keep looking up each chapter and seeing what happens and what does it mean. I could follow the overall narrative, but I do feel like there's a much deeper layer of meaning beneath all of that as well. I loved all the fantastical elements. All of it just gelled really well with me. I would give it a 4 out of 5. That is my last in-translation book of the year as well. Book number 2, this is my slowpoke. This is The Handmaid's Tale, and this is not so much me finishing this book as it is me finally acknowledging that it's done. So I was required to read this in year 11 of high school for advanced English. I was also required to teach this, and on multiple occasions I was required to teach this, and I, each time, skimmed through the book quite quickly because I always thought that previously I'd finished it before. But every time I skimmed through, there were just details that I didn't really dissect or pull apart, and I feel like I did quite a disservice to some students that I taught this book to because I missed a lot of things. And this, for me, for my slowpoke category, is me trying to read back through the book and actually give it a proper amount of attention and a proper amount of detail. I don't like dystopias, and I think this is something that I've grown into as someone who read 1984 at quite a young age and really enjoyed that. The Handmaid's Tale follows a long line of dystopian novels which to me feel like revelations of problems and exaggerations of those problems. I shouldn't use that word exaggeration, I just mean like the logical extremity of those problems without any hope or solution. It's really just something to bring pessimism to the audience, to say that human nature is like this, that there will be the possibility of such extreme gender imbalance and theocracy, that individual freedoms are impinged upon. And I don't like that sense of hopelessness. I think that the novel tries its best, but it is very focused on talking about how something like Gilead could certainly happen, and to create pessimism in the audience, to say that this is happening in places in the world, or that this may happen very easily in America or Canada, where the author's from. It's not a book that celebrates much of anything. Rather, it's a book that just wants to make the audience afraid and worried and paranoid and a little bit less comfortable with the life they live in. And that's valuable, that's important. I think that from a political and a social standpoint, that is very important for fiction to do that. It's just not quite how I like to engage with fiction. I like the more positive side of things, not just like positive thematically, but positive as in pushing me to view the world in one particular way, where this is certainly pushing me away from certain views. And I haven't even explained anything of the book yet before I started complaining. This is a dystopian novel. This is set in the future Republic of Gilead, which is a theocracy, and it's focusing on the fact that women in the society have been stratified into various stereotypical feminine roles, like homemaker and like childbearer, and handmaids in the society are the childbearers. They have the function of being effectively just wombs for the commanders, and it's a whole bunch of strange pseudo-religious rituals for that to happen. A lot of it is designed to shock the reader, to be very grotesque and strange and a perverse representation of what femininity is. And I think for something that was written in like the 1980s, mid-late 1980s, is very effective. It's definitely something that shocks the reader, that presents an image that is lingering and lasting and quite scary. And one other thing that I quite like of Atwood's personal style is that she likes to play with the idea of truth. So The Handmaid's Tale is told in first person by the narrator Alfred, and she is recounting a story that is very non-linear, jumps back and forth in time, and she is uncertain of certain details as well. So the audience needs to piece that together and look at all the different layers of truth that exist here. So it feels a lot more human, it feels a lot more relatable to an individual than something like 1984, which for all intents and purposes feels more dissecting a fictional character. So I think it's successful. I think that as a book, the way it's written is really good. The themes are certainly very important. I don't mean to disparage the themes, the politics of the novel by saying that I don't like the way that it's communicated or the genre that it's being written in. I think that the ideas being raised are really important. I just think the way of discussing them in the lens of dystopia isn't what's valuable to me. It's a very personal thing for me to say. And there are a lot of feminist works that I personally really enjoy, and this one doesn't sit very high on that list, specifically because of how it functions for the reader. It's a novel that creates fear and uncertainty and paranoia, and in very small and brief moments celebrates human companionship and especially friendships between women, and that is a little ray of hope in this book. But for the most part, the fact that this book says that societies can and will one day turn into something like this, it doesn't sit right with me. And so I would give it a I'd give it a 3 out of 5, but out of my personal enjoyment. I don't think I've ever, well, I don't know if anyone really enjoys this book, hey, but I certainly wouldn't say that it's something that I enjoyed. And I can think of other books that have communicated the themes of this one, but in a way that I have been able to engage with and enjoy more. So I will flick some of those on the screen if I remember my editing, and I'll give this a 3 out of 5, and I will move on. I will not look at this book again. I am very happy that I can finally mark it off as done. Book number 3, The Cat's Table. This is my aesthetic cover. Look at this. This is so beautiful. It is a really simple, gentle coming-of-age novel by Michael Ondaatje, who, for all the other books that I've read and for all else that I know about him, is a deeply humorless high school literary writer. This is just fun. This is just a really nice book. This is about a young boy who is on a ship, and he's traveling on this ship from Sri Lanka to Canada. It's a kind of, or is it London? I can't remember now. It's a semi-autobiographical book as well, because the author is from Sri Lanka and moved away from there as a young age. It does have a bunch of other silly characters on this boat as well. It has close friends that the narrator makes. It has people of different ages, and they all congregate together on what's called the cat's table, which is kind of like the opposite of the captain's table. It's like the lowest ranked table of the ship. And so we have this bunch of misfits running about on this ship, having a bunch of misadventures or adventures, or however you like to call it. I love the insular setting. I love the way that for the most of the book it is still based on this shipwright, even though it jumps into the future and it explores the ramifications of the encounters the narrator has on the ship later in their life. Overall, it is just things that happen on this ship. And this is a really interesting ship. Lots of fun things happen. And I love the youthful narrator as well that gives us this interesting lens to experience it from. Now, I don't think this is a particularly lasting book. I don't think you could even find this in a bookshop anymore. I think it had its moment in whenever it was published, and then it was nice, and everyone was like, cool, and then we moved on and we didn't talk about it anymore, right? It's not like a classic. It's not winning any Booker Prizes. But it's nice, and I really enjoyed my time with it, and the font is massive. The font is huge, and so I finished this in 2 days, and I just want to say nice things about it. It's really fun and cozy and ship-like, and the cover is nice, and I give it a 4 out of 5. Okay, and the complete opposite of that is On the Beach by Nevil Shute, which is my aquatic for December. I thought, well, it is about beaches. It's about a lot of other things. The premise of this book is that there is a nuclear explosion there's a whole full-blown nuclear war across China and Russia and the USA and all the world, and in Australia, I think the western coast of Australia in Perth, there is a radioactive cloud that is slowly floating around the world and just killing everybody. And the beach at Perth, I want to say it's Perth, but I don't think it's Perth. This beach is one of the last places that the radioactivity cloud will reach, which means that all the people there have a few more months left to live, and they live out their lives in an ordinary way. They try to grasp this sense of impending doom that's approaching them, and it's not a whiz-bang, pow, extreme apocalypse like blindness or like The Handmaid's Tale or like The Walking Dead or whatever kind of apocalypse you want. It's a slow, quiet apocalypse because all the rest of the world is gone and there's nothing that any of the characters can really do about it. And so they're just choosing various different ways to live out the next couple of months of their lives, knowing that they're not going to be able to have more time after that. And so it's a very sad work. It's a really, really sad work. It does show human beings in their most ordinary, but tinged with that kind of extreme sadness because a lot of the things we talk about are futile. Like there's lots of motifs about characters going to university or planting plants or sharing time with their loved ones, knowing that all of these moments are just terminal, that they're not meaningful, that there's going to be plants and pets and family members that they're never going to be able to see again because everybody's going to be dead in a few months. And they talk about the interplay between logic and emotion and the idea that sometimes going through the old motions is important even if they're totally futile, even if the plants that you grow are not going to fruit by the time that everyone dies. Is it still worthwhile to tend to them, to fertilize them, or do you just live out a life of total hedonism? How do you go about it? And at its core is a relationship between a sea captain who is on a mission around the world in a submarine to try and see how the rest of the world is, see if there's any chance of life coming back, I guess, and a young lady who is not written well. In the grand scheme of men writing women, I would say that the female lead of this book is written quite poorly. She is an object of masculine desire and completely unbelievable as a human being. I just couldn't do it, especially in the early moments where she's represented. I just don't believe it. I just don't believe that she's a real person. She's just such a male gaze caricature of a woman that I couldn't do it. And I think that really soured my interpretation of the rest of the book, where I get it's meant to be realistic and everyday and ordinary, but we have this glaring character who is just, in my eyes, not a human being. And so I just didn't feel nearly as strongly as I would have liked to. And whilst I like the idea, I like the premise, I actually think the writing is quite good. There are some certainly very boring moments, but I understand they're boring for a purpose. It's supposed to be everyday, it's supposed to be ordinary. It's supposed to be sad within that ordinary and everyday, but I just don't think it's successful because many of the characters just don't feel human. And I want to say that I like it because I love melancholia style works. I love quiet sadness and slow sadness, I just don't think that this one was very successful in doing that. I would give it a 2 out of 5. One other thing that I want to talk about Nevil Shute as well, and I hate to bring politics into the way that I interpret and raise books, especially in times where I don't think I'm correct, and this time I don't know if I am. I don't know anything about Nevil Shute other than he wrote this and A Town Like Alice. But to me, across these 2 works that I've read, there is a strong anxiety about the decay of specifically British Australia. The idea of Australia as a British colony that inherited British values and the power of the British Empire across the world. Now, this was all written in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, at a time when the British Empire was certainly losing a lot of its influence around the world, and it's that quiet departure of British influence that I think this book is trying to get at. So it's not so much a book about nuclear anxiety or Cold War politics. It's more about that very specific British way of life that is going away, because that, first and foremost, is what the scenes in Australia are like in this novel. It's about a way of life that is very recognizably British, not even Australian in the way that I would see Australian culture today, but specifically British, like British hobbies, British ways of speech, British connections, and an American main character, Commander Towers, who is trying to get acclimated with this British style of life. And I really couldn't ignore that as well. And because of that, the poignancy is lost a little bit, because I personally don't vibe with specifically British values. Me as someone coming to Australia when the last vestiges of British connections are not really there anymore, it's just not something that means a lot to me. This is something that really held me back from enjoying A Town Like Alice as well, because A Town Like Alice is very, very much about bringing stoic and kind of enduring British values to the Australian outback, whereas this one is now about the departure of those values from the whole world. In either case, it just doesn't do it for me that much. I could be wrong, but that's just how I take this author and his overall themes. Okay, book number 5, this is The Stars by Destination by Alfred Bester. I didn't know really anything about this book, except that I did not like the cover. This cover was so silly to me. And everybody who's everybody has talked about how great this novel is. Like, at the back, the 2 quotes saying that this is the best sci-fi novel ever, and I can't think of anyone who doesn't like Alfred Bester's work. And also the afterword, we have Samuel R. Delany, William Gibson, and Neil Gaiman. So very, very well-respected authors and speculative all say that this is the greatest thing ever. And having read this, it's the greatest thing ever. It's so good. It's actually quite hard to explain how incredibly good it is for something written in the 1950s. So I can divide it into 2 sections. First of all, putting it into its own context, the fact that the themes of this book are written in the 1950s is unfathomable because of the way that it represents society, the way that it represents human beings, and overarching themes, but also the technology that's present in this. It hasn't dated at all. In fact, if you release this book next year, it will still feel extremely relevant and extremely modern. The pacing is fast and interesting. It's got nice connections to the past and to classical literature, but it also is just so easily written and so, I hate to say this, but well consumable. It's great. And then in a overall standpoint, so now I actually told what the book is about, this is my top straight. So we have Nomad, or Gully Foyle. So he is a layperson, he's a worker on a spaceship, and due to various movements of giant corporations, is left for dead, floating out in the middle of space. Now, this novel is set in a future where teleportation has been, if not invented, then discovered. There was one scientist who was dying because of a failed experiment, and he willed very strongly that he could appear across the, in a different room, and he did. And so people realized they could do this if they just have a strong force of will to appear somewhere else. And so they developed schools and training, and everybody can do this now. Society massively had to reshape itself around the fact that teleportation became real, in very much the same way that it had to reshape itself with the invention of the internet. If you look at the internet as something like as something like telepathy, then the way that the internet massively reshaped the world in terms of things like globalization, in terms of things like the dot-com boom, in terms of the different ways that we see commerce and education. Like, we have specific internet classes at schools now. For a novel before the internet, to predict the way that a new technology or discovery like that can massively reshape the world and commerce, this is crazy. This is just genuinely so forward-thinking and so amazing, because a lot of those things that happened when the internet reshaped the way we look at the world is exactly how teleportation reshapes society in the Stars Matters Nation. So given that, given a human race that is expanded out into space because of this new technology, given giant multinational corporations or multiplanetary corporations that got very rich because they could first exploit these technological advances, and then given the propensity of human beings to go into conflict, so the wars that begin because of resources needed for this kind of giant revolution, we now have massive thematic complexity. I think the themes in this book just go so deep into human nature, into large corporations. It's very anti-capitalist as well, which of course I love. But also we have this very human story of a space worker who is just left for dead, and his personal desire for revenge, and how that desire really unveils the underlying conflicts within that society, and how various economic forces will leave an individual in that situation in the first place. Now, within that, we also have this individual quest narrative. So what happens by this person is that they first teleport themselves into this strange cult where they get this tattoo over their face and the word nomad on their head, and that makes them at first very noticeable, but also a figure that really shakes up the different power structures, governments and corporations in the novel. I just think that all of it is paced so well, and it has an incredibly paced plot. It is such a fast-paced plot. It's incredible to me how fast this book can be, even having such thematic depth, compared to something like Dune, which has, I would even say, a similar amount of depth to this work. Dune is so slow. Dune is like a fake history book level of detail, whereas this is just gas the entire time. It starts gas and it continues gas. The only thing that's slow about it is like a single prologue that is 5 pages long, and then we get Gully Fall story, and then it's just gas the entire time. It's so fast, and it doesn't feel like it sacrifices its depth at all to achieve this speed. It's just, I just don't understand how it can be this good. It's genuinely amazing. I really can't fault anything about it. Even its representation of women, and I have to mention it. For the 1950s, its representation of women is what you would expect for the 1950s. For today, its representation of women is not good, but having just talked about On the Beach and its view of women, I think the women in the Stars Matters Nation are much better realized. They have much more purpose than just being romantic objects. They have their own representations in terms of the novel's theme, and they have also a much greater weight in terms of how the plot turns. Now, I do think that it is a man's story for men. It's definitely that individual revenge plot, undermine the whole society, do that, all that stuff. Gets a little bit Fight Clubby at times, you know, to me it feels like a blokey story, but I also don't feel like it's detracted from by its representations of women or race or other marginalized identities. I think for the most part, it's timeless. I think it's something that can very much be enjoyed today, something that I would recommend to everybody today. I would give it a 5 out of 5. Book number 6 is Crook Manifesto by Colson Whitehead. This is the sequel to Harlem Shuffle, which I read earlier this year. I'm starting to really get used to this book, this style of book, and I'm really enjoying it. So just like Harlem Shuffle, this is a 3-act novel. It's got 3 individual moments in Harlem following the same character, Ray Carney, who's a furniture salesman in Harlem, who is connected to various criminal figures, and who is always teetering in that balance between, is he a criminal or is he not? This book also focuses a lot more on Pepper, who is less debatably a criminal. Pepper is definitely a criminal. He's more of like a hired muscle, right? So he's someone that works with Ray Carney at times, works with other people at times, but he's someone who gets things done, not necessarily in a legal way. So they're both now really well realized and really sympathetic characters. I think when I was first reading Harlem Shuffle, because Harlem Shuffle is set earlier in history as well, Harlem Shuffle is more about the 1950s and 60s, and I also didn't understand the geography and the history of the area quite as well. I didn't like it as much. Whereas Crook Manifesto, to me, almost feels like going back to a place I'm familiar with. I'm going back to characters that I know and that I continued really well in this book. I'm also going back to themes that are familiar but being built upon. And this book takes place in the 60s and 70s, and I think the late, yeah, just the 70s, only the 70s. But it's a bit more familiar, and it really focuses on this theme of changing hands, changing societies. The city starts changing between something it was before and something new, and how are the assumptions of crime and, I guess, like underworld power, how does that retain its identity, or how does it change over time? So I think overall it's done really well. The three capers that happen here are, to me, they have more action than the first book. I think it's, to me, more relevant, a bit faster, there's lots of more memorable moments. The writing, to me, is a bit better as well. So Colson Whitehead has this very cool style. He has stylized sentences that are not too long, but not too sparse either. Lots of sentence fragments, dialogue, quirky dialogue, but not in a unrealistic way, more in just like a kind of shorthand sort of way. So I can't read it very quickly. It takes me some time to figure out exactly what is happening, but I do like the rhythm and cadence of the speech. I find that it's something quite pleasurable. And now that I've gotten more used to it, this is the second novel of Colson Whitehead that I've read, I think I'm getting better at reading his work, and it's allowing me to appreciate it more. So I would say that this is not a good introduction to his work, but as you continue to read the things that he's put out, I don't know why I'm even allowed to say this, because I haven't read the main ones. I haven't read The Nickel Boys, I haven't read Underground Railroad, they're on the list. But if you're familiar with that style, and if you really like it, then this is a worthy continuation of what's happening in Harlem Shuffle. I give it a 4 out of 5. And speaking of crime, last novel of 2023 is The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. This is the last of my ABCD category, and I think I can say this now. The last of the Wilkie Collins books I will ever read in my lifetime. This is a early crime novel, and lots of people will tell you about how great it is. I am not. I'm going to complain about it a lot, so I'm very sorry if you like this book. You don't have to watch the rest of the video, I don't care. So this is about a very valuable diamond that is stolen from India by a general who's in the area, and that general passes it down in the family to Rachel Verinder, who's the novel's heroine. So she's turning 18, she inherits this absolutely ridiculous diamond jewel, like massive diamond jewel, to be used as a brooch and a decoration. And isn't that a very silly colonial thing to happen in England that would only really happen in the Victorian era? And there are 3 Indian people, the way the novel refers to them is a bit inconsistent, but 3 people from India who travel to Britain and seem to be using subterfuge to try and get this diamond back because it's theirs, right? It's not properly owned by the daughter of this general, and it makes no sense for it to be. So we have these 3 Indian characters stalking the heroine and trying to figure out how to get the diamond back to India. In the same time, the diamond, surprise, gets stolen, but not by the 3 Indians. So we have to figure out what happened to this diamond, how does that interact with Rachel Verinder's various romantic prospects in Victorian England, because of course it is, and how in this giant house party that happens, that this diamond can go missing. Now, as an early detective story, I think that it is functional and that it works. I think it is much too long to be good. In fact, the average detective story has 3 acts. It has the setup, which should be really short. It should just be, here's the crime, here are the clues. Then it has the middle, which is the most pleasurable part. This is the seeking out of evidence, trying to solve the crime, and then we have the resolution where everything is revealed, we get a satisfying explanation for how things happened the way they did, and then we go away, right? This shouldn't take a lot of time. This should take, at most, about 50,000 words. Most tech novels fall within that length, and if it gets longer than that, it's either a much more complicated mystery, or it has more literary elements, like it wants to explore characters and themes and things like that. So I would not necessarily say the Moonstone is a literary novel. It does not explore that many themes. It is a cross-section of Victorian life, mostly because I think the author likes it that way, but it's very certainly not saying anything high-minded about colonialism or about crime or morality or whichever, right? It's supposed to be a fun caper, and it does not spend a lot of time on the thematic side of things. So why is it so long then? Why is it 500 pages? Why is it 200,000 words? It's because it's fluffy. It's really excessive. It wastes so much time. It's a 5-act story where Act 1 is the jewel goes missing, and that's about 100 pages. We get the lead up, we get the party, we get the introduction to all the characters. We get it narrated by Mr. Betteridge, who is the leader of the servants in this big English manor. And he is someone who, for some weird character trait, loves Robinson Crusoe, can tell the future by reading Robinson Crusoe. I don't know, I don't understand British people, right? So we get those first 100 pages. Jewel's missing, fine. Then we get 2 more acts, which is narrated by Miss Clack, who is a religious fundamentalist who is constantly leaving these religious tracts. So little "you'll go to hell if you do this" signs everywhere. And she is one of the most frustrating characters that I had to read the perspective from, and she goes for about 100+ pages. She's so annoying, but it also annoys me more the fact that the author clearly wants to make fun of her. The author is satirizing religious people like her, and it's just frustrating for that reason, and also because that she's just not a very good person. Like, she's very hypocritical. She doesn't believe in any of the actual things that she's handing out. She's so judgmental of all the other characters. She's just awful. And also, in that section where she's narrating, nothing relevant to the Moonstone being stolen really happens. We instead get a bunch of Victorian fluff about families and relationships, and Rachel Verinder being really weird, and how she doesn't like Rachel Verinder because it's too outspoken, and how the whole marital prospects are going, and it's just... I don't care. It doesn't matter to me at all. It's just not that important to me. I find that maybe it would have been important to Victorian if they live in that societal context where marriage is, you only get one shot, do not miss the chance to blow, or whatever you call it, where a lot of the conflicts in Victorian novels are because someone married the wrong person and now they're stuck there forever, right? That's just not something that's relevant to me or modern readers in general. And so that whole 100+ page section of figuring out who she's going to marry and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is just wasted time in my respect, because there's this jewel that's gone missing, which ostensibly I'm supposed to care about, but I also don't, because let's say the jewel went back to its rightful owners. Good, right? That's what I want it to happen. I don't want the jewel to go back to Rachel Verinder anyway. But if that was the structure of the novel, that something has gone missing and you want it to be given back to the narrator, we are still spending so much time away from that plot to just fluff about for a bit. And then when the novel finally gets back on track, that's when it resumes being okay. I think that the actual mystery elements of the plot are actually pretty good. The red herrings and the clues and everything do fall into place. It's not mind-blowing, because of course it isn't. It's one of the first examples of the genre, but it's pretty good for what it is. I think that there are twists toward the end that are surprising and effectively done. And I've said this about the Woodman and White as well, reading Collins, is that he's a very good plotter. He's not a good pacer, but he's a good plotter. He is good at doing events that lead into other events, and events that feel like logical consequences of events that happened previously. So we follow along the plot really neatly, and when it does kick into gear, it's quite compulsive. And I finished the novel really easily, even though getting through the early parts was more of a struggle. I don't think it redeems the book, though. I think that if you want to read a mystery, don't read this. Read everything else except for this. This is only if you want to see the historical roots of the genre, to see where it began, to see where authors from the late 1800s, the early 1900s, who were really developing the crime genre and the caper detective genre, to see where they were getting their style and ideas from. And even this is 20 years after the Edgar Allan Poe short stories that other people consider to be the first mystery stories, right? This is, if anything, the first mystery length novel, and even that's a bit debatable, but it is early. It is early in the game, and we do see a complete mystery here, and it's fine. But the actual reading experience of it is just tedious and dull and mean-spirited, and at times quite racist. So the representations of the Indian characters are just very Orientalist, and say what you want about it, but they are presented as villains for almost the entire time. There is a reading of it that is anti-imperialist, because it's saying that ultimately these are characters that disrupt British life as a consequence of imperialism. But even then, I just think that there are much better works that explore these themes and ways that do it without that whole Oriental lens. I just don't like this one very much. I think The Woman in White for Collins novels is also a much better novel. The Woman in White is better paced, has better stakes, it has more than just a valuable object disappearing, and it's better. So if you must read Collins, go read that, but do not read this. This is a 2 out of 5. Alright, and that is my last 7 books of 2023. So ultimately this year I read, I think, 104 novels, and I will be doing a wrap-up probably in about 2 weeks' time, so depends on how much time I get. Aside from that, I will see you guys next year. Have a very wonderful new year, and yeah, take care.